All right, let's dive in. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on some of history's most famous monarchs. We're going past the stuffy portraits and the fancy titles to get to the really good stuff, the surprisingly human and honestly kind of weird side of royalty. Seriously, what's the first thing that pops into your head? For most of us, you're probably picturing a heavy crown, a giant throne, maybe one of those super serious portraits you see in a museum. You know, it's all about dignity, power, and this sort of untouchable vibe, right? Well, as you're about to find out, the reality of their day-to-day lives was often way stranger and a whole lot more fascinating than any of those formal pictures would have you believe.
So, first up, let's talk about some pretty strange personal habits. I mean, these are people who could have literally anything they wanted, and what they chose to do is, well, you'll see.
This little gem of a belief belonged to none other than King Louis XIV of France. You know, the Sun King, the guy who built the incredible Palace of Versailles. He had some very strong opinions about hygiene.
So how strong were his opinions? Well, historical records suggest that he took a full bath just 3 times in his entire life. Yeah. To keep himself clean, he'd apparently just wipe his face down with a cloth soaked in alcohol. But hey, Louis wasn't the only one with a thing against water. Over in England, King Henry VIII also stayed away from drinking it, but his reason was way more practical. See, back then, the water was often pretty nasty and could make you really sick. So his solution? Just drink ale instead. He even had his own brewmaster on staff to keep a safe and steady supply coming. And while some royals were avoiding things, others were spending like there was no tomorrow. This number? That's what Marie Antoinette of France supposedly spent on fashion every single year. We're talking the modern equivalent of over $3.5 million on dresses, jewelry, and crazy hairstyles. Just an unbelievable amount of money. Okay, so moving on from personal quirks, how did these rulers actually show their power? It wasn't always about golden castles. Sometimes the symbols they used to show their authority were way more interesting and personal than that. Just think about this list for a second. A dragon, a book about witches, an elephant, and just knowing a bunch of languages. These weren't just random hobbies, you guys. Each one was a very specific tool that helped define who they were and how they ruled. For King Henry VII, who started the whole Tudor dynasty, the red dragon was basically the ultimate PR move. It was a bold, in-your-face symbol of his Welsh roots, which helped him legitimize his claim to the throne after he'd won it on the battlefield. And then you've got King James I of England. His symbol of choice was a little darker. The man was completely obsessed with witchcraft, so much so that he actually wrote the book on it, Demonology. This book pretty much became the instruction manual for witch hunters. Talk about a personal obsession influencing policy. You know, sometimes the symbols weren't things they chose, but things they were given. When Queen Victoria got a baby elephant from the King of Siam, that's modern-day Thailand, it wasn't just some crazy pet. It was this huge diplomatic statement that perfectly captured the massive, worldwide reach of her empire. But maybe the most powerful symbol of all wasn't something you could see, but something you could hear. This number, 9. It points to a skill that is just mind-blowing, held by one of history's most iconic queens. That's right, Queen Cleopatra, the 7th of Egypt, could speak at least 9 different languages. But here's the craziest part. For 300 years, her Greek-speaking family had ruled Egypt without any of them bothering to learn the language of the actual Egyptian people. Cleopatra was the first and only one. This was a genius political move that connected her directly to her subjects in a way none of her ancestors could. All right, so we've covered their weird habits and their power moves. But what was the job actually like? Let's wrap things up by looking at just how long these people had to do it and some of the real-world challenges of sitting on the throne. Think about this. In an age where the average person was lucky to live to be 35 or 40, King Ramses II of Egypt lived to be about 90. He ruled for 66 of those years. He outlived so many of his own kids that, to his people, he basically became a living god. And this isn't just some ancient history thing either. We've seen it in modern times. Queen Elizabeth II's reign of over 70 years made her the longest reigning monarch in British history. It's just wild to think about the amount of change someone sees from that position over that much time. But here's the funny thing about having a long reign. It doesn't mean you're actually, there. Take Richard the Lionheart, one of England's most legendary kings. The guy was famous for being a great warrior, but he spent almost his entire 10-year reign outside of England, fighting in the Crusades. His kingdom was more of a home base to fund his real passion, the battlefield. So, when you boil it all down, what's the big takeaway? It's that behind every stuffy portrait and every fancy crown, there was a real, live human being. A complex person with weird habits, big passions, and lives that were anything but boring. And that leaves us with a final thought, doesn't it? It's so easy for us to look back at them and point out all their quirks. But imagine historians a few hundred years from now looking back at us. What will they find totally bizarre about our leaders, our culture, our world? What's our 3 baths or baby elephant story going to be? Thanks for exploring this with me.